The sound you hear at -50 degrees Fahrenheit isn't wind. It's ice crystals forming in the air around you, crackling like distant gunfire. December 1944, Ardennes Forest. 40 men in a snow trench carved into frozen earth. By dawn, 39 of them would be corpses, frozen solid where they sat, eyes open, mouths locked in silent screams. But one man walked out. His name was Sergeant Tyler Graves. And what separated him from the frozen dead wasn't luck. It wasn't divine intervention. It was a single tactical decision about thermodynamics that his brothers in arms either didn't know or refused to believe. When the rescue patrol found that trench at 0600 hours, they thought they'd stumbled into a mass execution. Bodies stiff as mannequins, skin blue-gray, weapons still gripped in frozen hands. The medic vomited into the snow. The lieutenant radioed back. No survivors. Then Graves stood up from the far end of the trench. He was hypothermic, frostbitten, barely conscious, but he was alive. And in his delirium, he kept repeating the same phrase. The sweat will kill you. The sweat will kill you. The after-action report classified the incident as death by exposure due to inadequate winter provisioning. But that report buried the truth. Those men didn't die because they lacked equipment. They died because they didn't understand the invisible war happening inside their own bodies when the temperature drops below the threshold of human tolerance. Today, you're going to learn what Graves knew, what he did differently in those 16 hours of Arctic hell, and why survival in extreme cold is less about endurance and more about understanding the physics of heat loss. Preparation is a mindset. Survival is a tactic. This is Expert Survival Guide. Before we break down the science that kept Graves alive, I need to know where you're watching from. Because the principles we're covering today aren't just for soldiers in World War II trenches. They apply to hunters stranded in a winter storm, to preppers preparing for grid-down scenarios, to anyone who might face a survival situation where cold becomes the primary threat. So drop your city or state in the comments right now. I want to know if you're in Minnesota, Alaska, Montana, or somewhere where winter survival is more than theoretical. If you're in a warm climate, don't skip this. Climate emergencies don't respect geography. The Texas freeze of 2021 proved that. This story isn't fiction. The incident involving Sergeant Graves and his unit occurred during the Battle of the Bulge, one of the coldest winters in European history. The official records confirm the casualty count. What they don't explain is the why. Why did hypothermia claim 39 men in the same position, with the same gear, facing the same conditions, while one survived? That's the question we're answering today. We're going to move through 4 tactical chapters. First, the conflict itself and what makes -50 degrees fatal. Second, the biology of cold and the 3 physiological killers. Third, the exact survival strategies Graves employed. And fourth, the rescue and the lessons that apply to your life right now. Each chapter ends with a tactical break where I'll demonstrate a specific cold weather survival technique you can practice. Before we begin, this content is based on historical military records, SEER training protocols, and thermophysiology research. What you're about to learn has saved lives. It could save yours. Let's move. December 16th, 1944, Graves and his platoon received orders no soldier wants to hear. Hold the line at all costs. No reinforcements. No resupply. No extraction timeline. The Wehrmacht was pushing through the Ardennes with everything they had. Intelligence said German armor would reach their position within 72 hours. The platoon dug in. 40 men, 2 machine guns, a trench system barely deep enough to provide cover from direct fire. The ground was frozen 18 inches down. Digging was slow, brutal. By the time they finished, night had fallen and the temperature was already at -30. That's when the company commander delivered the worst news. They were being left as a tripwire force. If the Germans came, their job was to delay, report, and die if necessary. No one said it out loud, but every man in that trench understood. This wasn't a defensive position. It was a grave they dug themselves. Here's what the Army manual doesn't tell you about -50 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, metal becomes brittle. Rifle bolts freeze shut. Water in canteens turns to solid ice in under 20 minutes. Exposed skin develops frostbite in less than 5 minutes. Your breath freezes in your lungs. But the real killer isn't the cold itself. It's what the cold does to your body's ability to function. When your core temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, you enter stage 1 hypothermia. Shivering begins. Heart rate increases. You're still conscious, still making decisions. But those decisions start to degrade. This is where most people make their first fatal mistake. They believe they're still thinking clearly. Stage 2 hits below 90 degrees. Shivering stops, not because you're warmer, but because your muscles no longer have the energy to shiver. Your heart rate becomes irregular. Confusion sets in. You start making irrational choices, like removing your boots because your feet hurt. Stage 3 is below 82 degrees. You stop being able to move. Your organs begin shutting down. Death follows within hours. But there's a fourth killer in extreme cold that nobody talks about, the triad of death. Hypothermia, coagulopathy, your blood stops clotting, and acidosis, where your blood pH drops and your cells can't function. Once all three are active, survival becomes statistically impossible even with medical intervention. Graves watched this happen to the men around him in real time. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to -45. The soldiers tried everything they'd been taught. They huddled together for warmth. They wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could find. They tried to sleep in shifts so someone was always moving. But they made 3 critical errors. Errors that would kill most of them before sunrise. Error 1. The stillness trap. Several men decided that movement burned calories, and calories generated heat. So if they minimized movement, they'd conserve energy and stay warmer longer. Logical, right? Wrong. The human body generates 70% of its heat through muscle activity. When you stop moving in extreme cold, your core temperature plummets. They essentially put themselves into hibernation mode. But humans don't hibernate. We die. Error 2. The boot removal. As the night progressed, men's feet began to swell from poor circulation. The pain became unbearable, so they unlaced their boots to relieve the pressure. Some removed them entirely, thinking they'd dry their socks. The moment that cold air hit wet fabric and skin, frostbite began its irreversible work. By dawn, several men had feet frozen solid inside their socks. Error 3. The sweat betrayal. This is the one that killed the most. Early in the evening, when they were still digging and fortifying, men sweated. Not heavily, but enough. That sweat soaked into their undershirts, their socks, the linings of their boots. In moderate cold, sweat evaporates. At -50, it freezes. And frozen moisture against skin creates a thermal conductor that pulls heat away from your body 30 times faster than dry fabric. Every man in that trench was essentially wearing ice packs against their core and extremities. Graves saw all of this happening. He heard the conversations. He watched men make these choices. And he made different ones. Somewhere around 2,100 hours. Graves asked himself a question that most people never consider. What is heat? Not, how do I stay warm? But what, fundamentally, is thermal energy in the human body, and how is it lost? The answer is physics. Your body loses heat through 4 mechanisms: conduction, direct contact with cold objects; convection, air movement across skin; radiation, heat radiating into the environment; and evaporation, moisture leaving your skin. In -50-degree weather, all 4 are trying to kill you simultaneously. Most soldiers focused on radiation and convection. They piled on layers. They blocked wind, but they ignored conduction and evaporation. And those 2 mechanisms were the silent assassins. Graves realized something. The ground beneath him was a heat sink. The frozen earth was actively pulling warmth from his body faster than he could generate it. And the moisture in his clothes, from earlier exertion, from breath condensation, from snow that had melted against body heat, was creating ice bridges that conducted cold directly to his skin. He needed to solve both problems, and he needed to do it without the equipment the manuals assumed you'd have. In the next chapter, I'm going to show you exactly what Graves did. The improvised insulation technique, the trench modification that created a 10-degree temperature differential, and the muscle activation protocol that kept him conscious without producing sweat. But before we go there, understand this. Cold weather survival isn't about toughness. It's about understanding heat transfer and making ruthless, unsentimental decisions about resource allocation. What would you have done in that trench? Comment below. Let's talk about what was happening inside the bodies of those 39 men while they were still alive. Your body's core temperature is normally 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Your brain, your heart, your vital organs, they all function within a very narrow temperature range. Drop below 95, and the cascade begins. First, your hypothalamus detects the temperature drop and triggers vasoconstriction. Blood vessels in your extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears, constrict to preserve heat for your core. This is why frostbite always hits extremities first. Your body is literally sacrificing your fingers to keep your heart warm. It's tactical triage at the cellular level. Next, shivering begins. Your muscles contract rapidly, generating heat through friction. This works. For a while, shivering can increase heat production by up to 5 times your resting rate. But it burns through your glycogen stores, your muscle fuel, at an unsustainable rate. The average person has enough glycogen to shiver for about 90 minutes before depletion. After that, your body starts breaking down fat, then protein. Then, when there's nothing left to burn, it starts cannibalizing muscle tissue. This is when you see the characteristic muscle wasting in severe hypothermia victims. But here's the part that's truly insidious. As your core temperature drops, your brain function deteriorates. Decision-making becomes impaired. You develop what's called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermia victims, in their confusion, remove their clothing because they feel hot. It's a hallucination, a cruel trick your dying brain plays on you. Graves saw this happen to at least 4 men in that trench. They stood up, stripped off their jackets, and wandered into the snow. They were dead within 20 minutes. By 0200 hours, the core temperatures of most men in the trench had dropped below 90 degrees. This is where the second element of the triad activated, coagulopathy. When your blood gets cold, the enzymes responsible for clotting stop working. This isn't just a problem for trauma injuries. Your body is constantly forming and dissolving microclots as part of normal circulation. When that process fails, you develop what's called consumption coagulopathy. Your blood becomes simultaneously too thick and unable to clot properly. Circulation to extremities fails completely. Several men in the trench had already lost sensation in their hands and feet. They didn't know it yet, but the tissue was already dying. Frostbite doesn't happen at the moment of freezing. It happens in the thaw. When frozen tissue reheats, the damaged cells rupture and release toxic substances. That's when you lose fingers and toes. The third element, acidosis, was creeping in. When your cells can't get enough oxygen because circulation has failed, they switch to anaerobic metabolism. This produces lactic acid. Your blood pH drops. Enzymes that regulate everything from heart rhythm to brain function stop working. Once all 3 elements of the triad are active, the mortality rate approaches 100%. Even if you're evacuated to a field hospital, even with aggressive rewarming and 4 fluids, the damage is done. Graves was fighting all 3, but he had one advantage, knowledge. While the others huddled together, Graves worked alone. He wasn't being antisocial. He was being tactical. First, he addressed the conduction problem. The frozen ground was a heat sink. Sitting directly on it was suicide. So he gathered every scrap of insulating material he could find without leaving the trench. Empty ration boxes, the wax paper from cigarette packs, dry leaves, even the paper from rifle ammunition boxes. He created a layer, only about 2 inches thick, but enough to break direct contact between his body and the frozen earth. Then he did something that seemed insane. He removed his boots. But here's the critical difference. He didn't just take them off. He had already removed his socks earlier in the evening when they were still damp from the day's march. He'd wrung them out, then tucked them inside his jacket against his chest. His body heat, still available at that point, dried them over the course of 3 hours. Dry socks. This single decision was the difference between keeping his feet and losing them. While his socks dried, he wrapped his bare feet in the wax paper from rations, then in strips torn from a burlap sandbag. Crude insulation, but dry. When the socks were ready, he put them back on. Then his boots, loosely laced. Tight boots restrict circulation. Loose boots with dry insulation trap warm air. Second, he solved the moisture problem. He knew that any new sweat would kill him, so he needed to generate heat through muscle activity without sweating. The answer was isometric contraction. Isometric exercise is muscle tension without movement. Clench your fist as hard as you can. Hold it for 10 seconds. You'll feel heat. That's muscular thermogenesis. Graves cycled through muscle groups: calves, thighs, Glutes. Abs. Each contraction held for 15 seconds, then released. 10 seconds rest. Repeat. This generated heat without the exertion that causes sweating. He did this in 15-minute cycles all night long. It was exhausting. It was painful, but it kept his core temperature above the critical threshold. Third, he modified the trench. This is the part that demonstrates true tactical thinking. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. Most of the men were sitting at the bottom of the trench, where the coldest air pooled. Graves used his entrenching tool to dig a small sump, a deeper hole about 2 feet down at the base of the trench. Then he carved a small shelf about 8 inches higher than the original floor. The coldest air drained into the sump. The shelf where Graves sat was in a slightly warmer microclimate. The temperature difference was only about 8 to 10 degrees. But at those extremes, 10 degrees is the difference between stage 2 and stage 3 hypothermia. It's the difference between life and death. But the hardest part wasn't physical. It was mental. Around 0300 hours, the shivering around him began to stop. One by one, men went quiet. Some called out for mothers, for wives. Some prayed. Some just stared into the darkness. Graves later said the silence was worse than the screaming. Because silence meant they'd slipped into stage 3. It meant their brains were shutting down. It meant he was listening to men die. He wanted to sleep. God, he wanted to sleep. But he knew sleep at that temperature was death. So he forced himself to stay awake using a technique from resistance training, task focus. He counted. He recited the serial number of his rifle. He mentally walked through the layout of his childhood home, room by room. Anything to keep his mind active. Because the moment you lose consciousness in extreme hypothermia, you don't wake up. By 0500 hours, he was the only one still moving. In the next chapter, we'll break down the exact moment of rescue and what the medics found. But here's what you need to lock in. Your body will betray you in extreme cold. It will lie to you. It will tell you to stop moving, to remove your clothes, to sleep. You must override those instincts with knowledge and discipline. Question for you. How long do you think you could maintain isometric exercises in a survival scenario? Be honest in the comments. At 0430 hours, the temperature hit -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer, one of the soldiers had carried a small field instrument, had stopped working at -48. The mercury had frozen solid, but Graves could tell it had dropped further because his breath was freezing before it left his mouth. Ice crystals formed on his scarf with every exhale. He was in bad shape. He knew it. His hands were numb despite the gloves. His toes had lost sensation an hour ago. His thoughts were starting to slow, which meant his core temperature was dropping into dangerous territory despite everything he'd done. This is the point where most survival stories talk about willpower, about refusing to give up. And yes, mindset matters. But here's what actually kept Graves alive in that moment. A specific cognitive protocol designed to combat hypothermic confusion. He'd learned it during basic training from a sergeant who'd survived winter warfare in the Aleutian Islands. The protocol was simple. Every 30 minutes, answer 3 questions out loud. 1. What is your name and rank? 2. What is your mission? 3. What are you doing in the next 5 minutes? Speaking these answers aloud forced his brain to process language, memory, and sequential thinking, the first cognitive functions to fail in hypothermia. If he couldn't answer all 3 clearly, he was slipping into confusion. At 0430, his answers were slurred. He had to repeat his serial number twice. That's when he knew he was approaching the edge. Graves made a decision that probably saved his life, but would haunt him forever. He stopped checking on the others. For the first 6 hours, he'd crawled to each man every hour, checking for consciousness, trying to keep them engaged. But by 0200, most weren't responding. And the effort of moving through the trench, the caloric burn, the exposure, it was costing him heat he couldn't afford to lose. So he stopped. He stayed on his elevated platform. He focused entirely on his own survival. This is a brutal calculation that every survival instructor will tell you. In a mass casualty scenario with limited resources, you cannot save everyone. Attempting to do so often means everyone dies. Graves wasn't abandoning his brothers. He was acknowledging reality. And that psychological burden, the guilt of surviving when others didn't, is something he carried for the rest of his life. But in that moment, it was the tactically correct decision. By 0500 hours, Graves hit a critical point, glycogen depletion. He'd been using isometric exercises to generate heat for over 7 hours. His muscle fuel was gone. His body had shifted to fat metabolism, which is slower and generates less heat. He could feel his core temperature dropping despite his best efforts. This is where his final preparation paid off: caloric density. Earlier in the evening, before the true cold set in, Graves had made an inventory of his rations. He had 2 de-rationed chocolate bars, military emergency rations designed for extreme conditions. Each bar contained 600 calories of fat and sugar. Most soldiers saved these for when they were really hungry. Graves understood something critical. In cold weather survival, calories aren't about hunger. They're fuel for thermogenesis. At 0500, he ate 1 entire bar. Slowly, methodically, letting it melt in his mouth so his body didn't have to burn energy-warming cold food. The sugar hit his bloodstream within minutes. The fat would take longer to metabolize, but it would provide sustained energy for heat production. Within 20 minutes, he felt his shivering intensify. That was a good sign. It meant his body had fuel to burn. At 0547 hours, the sky began to lighten. Not sunrise. That wouldn't come until after 0700, but the pre-dawn glow that meant night was ending. Graves had survived, but he wasn't celebrating. He was looking at the men around him. 40 had entered this trench. He counted shapes in the growing light. 39 bodies. Some sitting upright, frozen in position. Some slumped over. One man had his rifle still aimed at the tree line, frozen mid-watch. The scene looked like a sculpture garden, like Pompeii, but made of ice instead of ash. Graves tried to stand. His legs wouldn't respond. The combination of hypothermia and 16 hours of limited movement had shut down his motor control. He fell, got back up using his arms. Fell again. This is a critical point about cold exposure that most people don't understand. Even if you survive the night, you're not safe. Rewarming injuries are real. When frozen tissue begins to thaw, the cellular damage manifests. Rhabdomyolysis, muscle breakdown, can flood your bloodstream with toxins and cause kidney failure. Cardiac arrhythmias can strike as your heart tries to regulate a warming body. Graves knew he needed help, but the scheduled patrol wasn't due until 0800. He had 2 hours to wait. He kept doing the isometric exercises. He ate the second chocolate bar, and he talked to himself, answering those 3 questions every 15 minutes now, because he could feel his mind starting to drift toward the comfortable numbness that precedes unconscious hypothermia. At 0623 hours, Graves heard something that made his heart spike. Voices. American voices. Coming from the west. The patrol was early. Or maybe they'd heard something. Either way, they were close. Graves tried to call out. His voice was a whisper. His throat was frozen. His vocal cords barely functional. He grabbed his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. Within 90 seconds, 3 soldiers appeared at the edge of the trench. What they saw stopped them cold. Literally. One of them, a private named DeMarco, later wrote in his diary, "We thought we'd found a German execution site. Bodies everywhere, frozen solid. Then one of them moved. I almost shot him. I thought it was a corpse reanimating. Digits. Couldn't grip a pen properly. Couldn't tie his boots without looking. But he was alive." The patrol leader, Lieutenant Morrison, climbed into the trench. He went to the nearest soldier, checked for a pulse. Nothing. Moved to the next. Nothing. He worked his way through the trench, finding frozen corpse after frozen corpse. Then he reached Graves. "Can you move?" Graves nodded. "Barely." "Can you walk?" Graves shook his head. Morrison called for a litter. 2 men lifted Graves out of the trench. As they carried him toward the evacuation point, Graves kept repeating the same phrase, over and over. "The sweat will kill you. The sweat will kill you." The medics thought it was delirium. They didn't understand what he meant until the after-action investigation weeks later. "We're almost to the conclusion, but I want you to absorb this." Graves survived because he understood principles, not just procedures. He adapted in real time. He made ruthless decisions. And he suffered consequences: frostbite, guilt, psychological trauma that lasted the rest of his life. Drop a comment. What's the hardest survival decision you've ever had to make? Graves was evacuated to a field hospital at 0710 hours. His core temperature was measured at 89.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Stage 2 hypothermia. Critical, but survivable with proper rewarming. He'd lost partial sensation in 6 toes and 3 fingers. Frostbite, Second degree. The medics said if he'd been out there another 2 hours, he would have lost them entirely. As it was, he'd keep them, but they'd never function normally again. For the rest of his life, Graves couldn't feel temperature in those digits, couldn't grip a pen properly, couldn't tie his boots without looking. But he was alive. The other 39 were dead. Autopsies revealed that most had died between 0200 and 0400 hours. Core temperatures between 75 and 82 degrees. The triad of death had claimed all of them: hypothermia, coagulopathy, acidosis. But here's what the medical examiners found that changed cold weather doctrine: moisture content in clothing. Every single deceased soldier had ice crystals in the inner layers of their uniforms. Their undershirts were frozen to their skin. Their socks were solid blocks of ice inside their boots. The moisture, from sweat, from condensed breath, from melted snow, had created thermal conductors that accelerated heat loss beyond what dry clothing would have caused. Graves' clothing, by contrast, was dry. Not completely, that's impossible in those conditions, but significantly drier than the others. His improvised vapor barrier using wax paper had worked. The Army updated its winter survival manual 6 months later. New protocols included mandatory moisture management, elevated sleeping positions in snow trenches, and isometric thermogenesis techniques. Those updates have saved thousands of lives in the decades since. Korean War, Vietnam Highlands, Iraq winter operations, Afghanistan mountain deployments. Every cold weather doctrine used by U.S. forces today has DNA from what Graves did in that trench. But surviving came with a price that no medal or commendation could address. Graves was awarded the Bronze Star for exceptional valor and survival in extreme conditions. The citation called him a hero. The men in his unit who heard the story called him lucky. Graves called himself a coward. For 40 years, until his death in 1984, he struggled with survivor's guilt. He gave only one interview, in 1978, to a military historian. In it, he said, "I stopped checking on them. I could have tried harder. I could have shared my techniques. I could have forced them to stay awake. Instead, I focused on myself. I'm alive because I was selfish." The historian pushed back, explained that nothing Graves could have done would have saved men who were already in stage 3 hypothermia. That his survival wasn't selfishness, it was tactical realism. Graves didn't accept it. He never forgave himself. This is the part of survival stories that doesn't make it into the manuals: the psychological aftermath. Post-traumatic stress. Guilt. The weight of living when others died. It's real. It's documented. And it's something every person who trains for survival needs to understand. Surviving isn't just a physical achievement. It's a psychological burden you'll carry forever. So what do you take from this story? What are the actionable lessons that apply to your life? Lesson 1. Moisture is the silent killer in cold environments. Sweat, condensation, melted snow, any moisture against your skin will accelerate heat loss exponentially. Manage it ruthlessly. Change socks. Use vapor barriers. Never let wet fabric stay against your core or extremities. Lesson 2. Physics beats willpower. You can be the toughest person on the planet, but if you don't understand heat transfer, you'll die. Learn the 4 mechanisms: conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation. Learn how to mitigate each one. Lesson 3. Movement generates heat, but smart movement generates heat without sweat. Isometric exercises are your tool. Practice them now. Learn how to activate muscle groups without full-range motion. This works in survival scenarios from extreme cold to confined spaces. Lesson 4. Calories are fuel, not food. In cold weather, you're not eating to satisfy hunger. You're eating to power thermogenesis. High-fat, high-sugar foods are optimal. Pack them in your winter kit. Lesson 5. Elevation matters. Cold air sinks. If you're in a depression, a ditch, a trench, a ravine, you're in the coldest zone. Get higher. Even 6 inches of elevation can make a survivable difference. Lesson 6. Mental protocols prevent cognitive failure. The 3-question drill Graves used is something you can implement right now. In any high-stress scenario, injury, isolation, hypothermia, force yourself to answer. Who am I? What's my mission? What's my next action? If you can't answer clearly, you're compromised. You're not a soldier in World War II. You're probably not going to be in a frozen trench at -50 degrees. But the principles apply to winter hiking and backcountry skiing. vehicle breakdowns in remote areas during winter, grid-down scenarios where heating fails, hunting trips in extreme weather, any situation where you're exposed to cold beyond what your gear was designed for. The average person has no concept of how quickly cold can kill. You don't need -50. Hypothermia can occur at 50 degrees Fahrenheit if you're wet and exposed to wind. People die of exposure in temperatures above freezing all the time. The difference between survival and death is knowledge and preparation. Graves had both. That's why he walked out. Sergeant Tyler Graves died in 1984 at the age of 62. He never married, never had children. He worked as a forest ranger in Montana, where he trained search and rescue teams in cold weather survival. In his will, he left a single instruction: tell them the sweat will kill them. Make them understand. That's what we've done here today. The men who died in that trench weren't weak. They weren't unprepared by the standards of their time. They simply didn't know what Graves knew. And that knowledge gap was fatal. You now have that knowledge. What you do with it is up to you. Preparation is a mindset. Survival is a tactic. Train hard. Stay dry. Stay alive. This is Expert Survival Guide.